Lesson 36, multiply and divide integers and terms. So first off, let's look at some rules. When you are adding, you subtract the absolute values, or to find the sum of the add-ins with different signs. So remember that they have different signs and you have like signs. If the signs are different, so if you're adding positive and negative numbers, you subtract the absolute values, and then the answer has the same sign as the greater absolute value. When the add-ins are the same, have the same signs, you add them together and use the same sign as the add-ins. So if you're adding two negatives, your answer is negative. If you add two positives, your answer is positive. And the subtracting is just adding its opposites. Use the sign with the greater absolute value. Well, for multiplication and division, you multiply like you normally would. When you're multiplying or you're dividing a positive by a positive, your answer is positive. When you're multiplying and dividing negative and a negative, it's still positive. The only time your answer is negative is if you're multiplying and dividing by a positive and a negative number. So let's take a look at some examples here. Negative 10 times negative 5. 10 times 5 is 50. Since all of them are negative, negative times a negative is a positive, so it's a positive 50. Positive 10 times a negative 5. 10 times 5 is 50. Since the signs are different, that leaves me with a negative as my answer. Negative 10 divided by negative 5. 10 divided by 5 is 2. Since the signs are the same, my answer is positive. 10 divided by a negative 5 is 2, but because one's negative, I have an answer of negative 2. Negative 12 times negative 3. 2 negatives times a negative is a positive 36. Negative 12 times positive 3 is a negative 36. Negative 12 divided by negative 3 is a positive 4 because I have two negatives. Negative 12 divided by 3 is a negative 4 because 1 is negative. Look at some word problems. Every month, $25 is automatically deducted from Newton's checking account to pay for internet service. Write an expression using integers to show that the effect on Newton's account of 6 months of charges. So each month is deducted $25. So that would be a negative $25 each month. And they're doing that for 6 months. So you would take your negative 25 times your 6, and that would give us a negative 150. So it would be a change of a negative $150 after the 6 months. The second problem, drilling for core samples in the sea floor. The driller used 12 drilled rods 8 meters long to reach from the surface of the ocean to the lowest core sample. Write an equation using integers that shows the depth of the core sample with respect to sea level. So when we look at that problem carefully, we have 12 drill rods, so 12 of those, and each one is 8 meters long to reach from the surface of the ocean to the lowest core. So they're talking about the depth of the core sample. So if each one is 8 meters long, you're going down from sea level. So that would be a negative 8. So we have 12 times a negative 8. 12 times a negative 8 would be a negative 96 meters. And just make sure you read carefully when they give you a word problem. So if you know if they're dealing with depth below, especially below sea level, that tells you your number is going to be negative. And some other samples here. when we are raising it to a power, if your exponent is negative, if your exponent is odd and you have a negative number in the parentheses, your answer is still going to remain negative. But if the base in the parentheses is negative and your exponent is even, then your answer is going to be a positive number. Okay, so negative 1 to the 5th power. That's negative 1. This is the same thing as saying negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. These make a positive, these make a positive. I'm left with a negative, so it's a negative 1. Negative 1 to the 6th power would be a positive 1 because you'd have negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, and negative 1. These two make a positive, these two make a positive, and these two make a positive. Everything's positive, so I have a positive 1. So for y equals x squared, find y if x equals negative 2. So what is y when x is a negative 2? So I square those. And again, the parentheses is important because you're squaring a negative 2. So it's a negative 2 times a negative 2, which give us a positive 4. If x squared is 9, then x can be which two numbers? Now, if you undo a square, you need to find the square roots of both sides. So if I find the square root of both sides, x has to be a positive and a negative 3. Because square roots can have a positive and a negative roots. Because a positive 3 times a positive 3 is 9. A negative 3 times a negative 3 is positive 9. Let's take a look at these examples on the right-hand side here. Negative 6 squared is a positive 36. Negative 1 squared is a positive 1. Negative 3 cubed is a negative 27, because I have an odd exponent here. Then negative 2 to the 4th power is a positive 16. And then solve x squared is equal to 100. Find the square root of both sides. X can equal a positive and a negative 100. And then we're looking at multiplying and dividing terms. And remember, when we multiply and divide terms, when we're dealing with exponents, when you multiply like bases, you add the exponents. When you divide like terms, you subtract the bases, or you subtract the exponents. So let's take a look at some examples here. We have 6 times a negative 2, which is negative 12. And then we have an x squared times x is x cubed, because 2 plus 1 is 3. Y times y is y squared. And then I have a z. Next one on the bottom, 6 divided by negative 2 is a negative 3. X squared divided by x, 2 minus 1 is 1, so just x. Y divided by y, they cancel each other out. And then I have a z in the denominator. I would have an answer of negative 3x divided by z. Next one, negative 12 times 3 would give you a negative 36. X times x is x squared. Y squared times y is y cubed. And then I have a z in my answer. Next one, a negative 12 divided by 3 is a negative 4. X divided by x is 1, they cancel out. Y squared divided by y, 2 minus 1 is y. And then I have a z left over. So my answer would be negative 4yz. And our last slide here, we need to expand, so we're going to use a distributive property. So 3 times 2 is 6. X times x is x squared. Minus 3 times 4 is 12. X times 1 is just x. So our answer would be 6x squared minus 12x. Next one, negative 3x times 2x be negative 6x squared. Negative 3, and here I would treat this as a negative 4. So negative 3 times a negative 4 is a positive 12, and then I have an x. The other way of doing that would be negative 3 or negative 6 x squared minus negative 3 times 4 is a negative 12x. Because you're subtracting a negative, that makes it a positive. Next one, 2x times 2x is 4x squared. 2x times 5 is 10x. And our last one, distribute. Negative 2x times 2x is a negative 4x. Negative 2x times a negative 5, and that's the same one as from before, but give me a positive 10x. That is our lesson today on multiplying, dividing integers.